We'll just start any second now. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. My name is Zach Pakin, and I am a non-resident research fellow affiliated with IPD, as well as a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to what is certainly an incredibly timely panel and an important discussion that we'll be having today. And we've got four excellent experts. For those of you who are familiar with the field, you will know that we've got an outstanding caliber set of experts joining us today to discuss these issues. For those of you who are not familiar with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, we are a North American think tank that analyzes foreign policy issues from a perspective privileging realism and restraint. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. So our four panelists joining us today are Paul Stronsky, who is a senior fellow in Carnegie's Russia and Eurasia program. Thanks so much for being with us today. Bill Wohlforth is the Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. Thank you very much, Bill, for joining us. Sergey Radchenko is the Wilson E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins SAIS. Thanks for being with us, Sergey. And last but not least, Marie Dumoulin is the Director of the Wider Europe Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, as well as a career French diplomat. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Paul, I'd like to start with you. Can you just give us a little bit of an update, help our audience to understand where things stand right now in the war? So are we close to a deal between Russia and Ukraine to cease hostilities, as there appears to have been some hope in that direction over the past few days? Or do you foresee likely that there are quite potentially several weeks still of armed conflict lying ahead?
I hope that I am wrong, but I sadly see that we're probably several weeks, if not even longer, towards any sort of a sustainable ceasefire. The problem that we've seen is that yes, there have been lots of diplomatic discussions over the past 48, 72 hours, and that's a positive front. But even the U.S. Secretary of State today, who the State Department a few days ago seemed way more optimistic than they are today. And I see these two lines of effort that we're seeing on the sort of de-escalation front. They are one, it is for humanitarian corridors, but we have seen Russia, just yesterday, again, fire on, bread lines and complicate the ability, not abide by the humanitarian corridors it's already agreed on, and preferring to have them actually go towards Russia, which is not where people want to go. And then the second component is, some sort of a deal with Ukraine that Ukraine would declare its neutrality, still be able to keep its military, and they would come to some sort of arrangement on the Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. But while this is happening, we've continued to see sieges of civilian populations. We saw the war pretty much expand today further into Western Ukraine. And so I'm deeply troubled. I think the worst might still be ahead of us. And I think we've seen this negotiating tactic with the Russians before in other avenues where they are both at the same time negotiating while raising up the stakes, and particularly the targeting of civilian populations and moving into Kyiv itself proper, I think is really quite troubling for the future.
Paul, just a quick follow-up, which is some people have floated the idea that Russia is basically very close to tactical exhaustion on the battlefield and that they can only sustain these losses for another couple of weeks. Obviously, that means this could go in one of two directions. Either this could result in a significant defeat for Russia and political change within Russia's borders to a certain extent, or it could encourage Russia, as unfathomable as it might be to imagine them carpet bombing the mother of all Russian cities to the ground. It could encourage them to escalate. How do you interpret that analysis? Is Russia really, can they really only sustain these losses for another week or two?
Well, I think the Russian government badly miscalculated, and Putin badly miscalculated on a number of fronts. They didn't prepare their population and their own military for a lengthy campaign, and they underestimated the ability of the Ukrainian army, but also of the ability of the Ukrainian people to resist. And so, what we've seen, what they thought was going to be a very quick campaign, where they could, probably entice and convince the Ukrainian government to collapse. They have not been met, with flowers as they thought, and that the deeper they get entrenched there, they did not want to hit civilian targets at the start. They said they were avoiding them, and in the first few days they tried to avoid them. But we've seen further and further moves towards, missile attacks and really deep destruction. So that's what I fear. We've also seen sort of a purge start within some of the Russian security services. I think that is a clear indication that Putin is not happy and recognizes things are not going well. But I think Putin, his credibility right now at home is on the line, and he has no place else to go. So yes, there are certain splits, and there's lots of disagreement, but we are seeing a very harsh authoritarian turn, which I think suggests that he intends to hold on power for as long as he can. And so I think all of these systems look extremely stable until one day they are not. But I think we can still. I think we still have to fear that this could go along for quite a while.
I'll come back to the question of Russia's authoritarian turn in a second, but first I want to go to Marie about the negotiations that are currently underway between Russia and Ukraine. Some of Russia's proposals, like Ukrainian neutrality being formalized, certain limits on the size of Ukraine's military, they appear to be negotiable or possibly acceptable from Kyiv's perspective. But there are others that clearly appear to be a red line from Zelensky's perspective, right? Recognizing Crimea as being a part of Russia, recognizing the Donbas republics as being independent, etc. So I'm wondering if you can give us a sense, where do you think there's wiggle room in these talks to achieve a deal? And if there is a deal that is reached at some point, whether it's in days or in weeks, is this something that will immediately be welcomed in Western circles, or rather will we in the West start to draw red lines and say, oh, no, you can't recognize Crimea?
Well, I think there are two ranges of issues that are being discussed. The first range has to do with the status of Ukraine with regards to security, and that's the Russian demand that Ukraine has some sort of neutrality status. What we get from Zelensky's declarations in the last few days is that some kind of an understanding could be reached, but it implies very serious security guarantees, legally binding, and probably from Western countries. And on this, I don't know how much of it is acceptable to Russia also, because a legally binding...
I think we've lost your audio, Marie.
Sorry, the connection might...
You're not on mute, but we've lost your audio for some reason.
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Oh, I do. Maybe the problem's on my end. My apologies.
No. It may be the internet connection working poorly. Well, anyway, I was saying Ukraine expects to have serious, legally binding security guarantees from Western countries if it is to accept neutrality. Now, for Russia, it's pretty much the same as having Ukraine being a member of NATO. So I still don't see where the common ground could be on this issue. The second range of issues has to do with territory. There is this Russian demand to have the recognition of Crimea annexation and of the independence of both statelets in Donbas. Now, Russia also has conquered more territory over the last weeks. And so, first of all, the recognition of Crimea and Donbas is a difficult thing to swallow for Ukraine. But my question is also, what is to be done with this additional territory Russia has been taking over the last weeks? And in particular, the emphasis on Mariupol over the last days indicates that Russia is willing to create some sort of continuity between Donbass and Crimea to take control of the whole Azov Sea. And I don't see whether Russia would be ready to give it up. So it basically means Russia actually expects Ukraine to sign up to part of its territory being annexed to Russia as part of a deal. So for now, I don't really see where the common ground is and where the possibilities for a deal are. And I also don't think that any of the sides is ready for a compromise now, because Ukraine is actually resisting much more efficiently than expected, and it probably thinks it can resist some more time. And it's the big surprise is how poorly the Russian army is performing. So if this is a big, mighty Russian army, then the Ukrainians think they still don't have to capitulate because they can, they remain in a strong position. And the Russians probably think they have a big, mighty army and they can continue carpet bombing and putting pressure on Ukraine until Ukraine capitulates. So yeah, I'm not very optimistic at this stage of the negotiations. Very much will depend on where the fighting goes, but now is probably too early to envision a deal.
Understood. Thanks so much. Sergey, over to you. We're seeing two things happening in parallel over the past several weeks. On the one hand, we have seen Russia consolidate along an authoritarian model much, much more significantly than before. There's no doubt in anyone's mind, this is no longer a hybrid regime or a country that's stuck in transition. It seems to have landed pretty clearly on one side of the fence, and that has accelerated very much over the past several weeks. But on the other hand, when it comes to Russia's political aims in Ukraine, the initial aim of regime change, decapitation, denazification, as it were, that seems to have been dialed back. And Russia seems to be floating proposals basically saying the regime in Ukraine can stay in power as long as they are neutral and abide by certain security guarantees, etc. So what do we make from these mixed signals, right? On the one hand, the authoritarianism and Putin really digging in his heels, but on the other hand, perhaps some overtures.
Right, Zach. Well, those are partly connected, but also disconnected issues and narratives. Authoritarianism in Russia is not something new. It's Russia has been on this trajectory for some time. We can argue about when it got onto that trajectory, whether it was already evident that it was going somewhere off the rails in the 90s, or whether it's a more recent phenomenon. But I can, as any observer of Russia would say, certainly from 2011, 2012, there was a marked shift away from hope towards really grim future. And we saw increasing crackdown in Russia in recent years. But of course, things really accelerated, not even with the war. I mean, with the war, we've really seen expansion of authoritarianism in Russia, but with the referendum that allowed Putin to be re-elected and stand for their election later on. And I mean, at that time, there were, of course, there was the poisoning of Navalny, which was an important turning point. Protests have been brutally suppressed in Moscow. From 2019, there were a series of protests, and they just have become more and more brutal, and fewer people dare actually to go into the streets. I mean, one of the things that I was struck by, encouraged by, was to see so many Russians actually still dare go into the streets and protest against this brutal war, against this brutal regime, knowing what they're facing. I mean, let's be clear about it. In the last weeks or days even, the Russian parliament has adopted a series of new laws that make it punishable by imprisonment of up to 15 years to be critical of that war or to spread certain kind of information the government considers out of alignment with its own narrative. And yet, despite all of that, people are still going out there and protesting. What can you say to that? Brave people. But of course, there's also a climate of fear. Fear has crept in, and many people who could have maybe demonstrated in 2019 or who would have gone to Bolotne back, 10 years ago, are not going to dare now because they don't want to face the riot police. They don't want to face detainment and possible punishment. I say possible, not probable. And this is the difference between Russia of today and, let's say, Stalinist Russia or Soviet Union of the 1930s, because then hundreds of thousands of people were executed, millions of people ended up in the Gulag. Today, we're not seeing that, but we have and we may still see that. No longer, nothing is anything, and nothing is off limits at this point. But there's this arbitrary system in place which promises punishment, does not guarantee punishment, but it's intimidating enough to where people are increasingly worried about their future and are facing that difficult question. What do? Do you keep quiet? Do you align yourself with the authorities? Or do you actively protest? And fewer actively protest. So that's as far as the repressions go. Absolutely, you're right, Zach. We've seen in recent days, indeed, a further clampdown. And whereas previously I would have said, okay, Putin, this is not Stalinism. Let's just be clear about it. This is a different story. Now, yeah, I still say that, but look, I'm no longer so sure. I'm no longer I'm sure that we're not yet in 1937. Yeah, that's obvious. That should be obvious. And Putin is not Stalin just yet. What I'm no longer so certain about is that we're not on that trajectory. That is what makes me worried. So with regard to Russia and its aims in Ukraine, that's slightly different thing about whether, its war aims are changing. They may be or they may not be. And at least officially, I think they're still insisting on carrying out their original war plans. But reality has introduced their own nuances. It's very clear that the original war plan is dead, basically, because they couldn't do it. They couldn't carry out regime change. And it seems that they're not practically hoping to do this now. But the problem remains, how do you get out of this? It's like a quagmire. How do you accept defeat? Well, defeat is politically unacceptable back at home. Do you have the potential to escalate? Absolutely. Russia has the potential to escalate and turn Ukraine into bloodbath. It's already doing it. Ukraine is already in the state of utter humanitarian catastrophe, and cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol are being turned into Grozny's. We're seeing this before our eyes. There's potential for more, and this is what I'm really worried about. And here I would just echo what Paul said. I think he's absolutely right. It's a very scary situation. I think we might still see a deterioration in the coming days.
Gotcha. Let's bring Bill into the discussion now. Much of the Western discourse and discussion since the start of this conflict has been centered on ramping up sanctions against Russia, providing assistance to Ukraine, militarily speaking, economically speaking. I'm wondering if you feel if this has been at the expense of greater investment on our part in the West in diplomatic efforts to bring some sort of mutually acceptable solution or conclusion to this conflict. Can you help us understand that a little bit?
I think there's a limit to what we can be expected to do under the current circumstances. I share the colleagues' pessimism right now. We have to recognize we're operating under deep uncertainty about what the actual positions of the sides are, especially the Russian side. We can see leaks from the negotiations, comments by Ukrainian negotiators about what the Russians have said, and we see what the Russian negotiators have said, but then we see what the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, says. Often that's very different than what we're hearing from the negotiating process. And so things are happening. Clausewitz said it. I mean, once you get into wars, stuff happens. And one of the things that seems to be happening is a ramping up of expectations on the Western side about what the West can actually do. To the degree that Western leaders see this as a battle for world order and see this as a situation in which if Russia, in some sense, wins, the whole global order loses, if that's how it's framed, that's not good news for conflict settlement, because it means we, that is, say, those who stand behind Ukraine in its fight, are not going to want to push Ukraine to settle for anything that is not seen as a victory. And most people who study Russia don't think Russia is at all likely, or Putin is at all likely, to hang up a white flag and say, gosh, really sorry, big mistake, we're going home. So we have two sides with these conflicting views. We have what's looking like a stalemate in the theater It could be a stalemate, or Russia might have a plan C that's even more deadly, as Sergey just hinted at, sadly and tragically. And so without knowing that outcome, we don't know how these sides can find a deal. I'll just note one point of optimism and one point of pessimism. Let me actually do the pessimism first. And in giving you a slightly optimistic thing and a slightly pessimistic thing, I'm telling you like where I live every day, which is grasping at straws, you know, of hope, and then reading another speech by Putin, and his breath blows those straws away. And so I would say on the pessimistic side, in an interview, President of Finland said that when he talked to Putin, when Putin referred to Donetsk, he's not referring to those little statelets. He's referring to the provinces, to the oblasts, to the regions, which of course are much, much bigger. So if you thought Zelensky's never going to accept recognition of these little statelets as independent, for sure he's never going to respect those huge oblasts, those huge provinces as independent. Here's the one slightly optimistic thing I can grasp from that horrific, gray, sad, scary speech of Putin the other day, which is that if you read how he talked about the war, in part, he talked of it as essentially a preventive war. There's a rhetoric in there where he's saying, I'm doing this terrible thing. He doesn't say, I'm doing this thing to save Ukrainians. I'm doing this thing to save Ukrainians who think of themselves as part of the Russian world. And I'm doing it because Ukraine was on the cusp of a genocide against them. And Ukraine was on the cusp of acquiring chemical weapons. And Ukraine was on the cusp of building nuclear weapons. Of course, these are all fantastical claims, things that Ukraine had no intention of doing, and that no reasonable person can really believe that Ukraine was doing. But if that's how he frames it, you're actually opening up the space for some sort of solution in which he says he prevented this thing that was never going to happen. So that's the one, from the horse's mouth, tiny bit of optimism I can grasp, which is the more they frame this as a preventive war, the more victory can be claimed without destroying Ukraine.
Thanks for that optimistic note. I'm going to return to a pessimistic one now, though, for my next question to Paul, which is that it looks as if, as Bill just said, that Putin basically can't be deterred, right? He's not going to put up a white flag. That's just not who he is, and certainly not under these circumstances where he's bet so much of his own presidency, the past 22 years on this war. And so that basically means that the logic of sanctions, and they're very, very significant sanctions that have been imposed, is not a logic of deterrence. It must be a logic of regime change or change at the top. If we, intend to ratchet them up, that must be our presumable end goal at this point. So is that a problem? Does that make things dramatically worse in terms of the security dilemma we're in right now?
Yes and no. So some of the rhetoric around sanctions, I think it was a German economics or energy minister, said today that, sanctions were out there to, destroy Putin. And I think things like that are not very helpful. But sanctions are very much what we can do when we don't have any other option and when we don't want to escalate it militarily. So I think we are seeing NATO reinforce its its eastern flank, but pushing back at calls for a no-fly zone. Those are ways in which the West is trying not to not to get directly involved and not to risk this moving out of Ukraine into a broader European war. But sanctions, they originally were there to deter. Sanctions make us in the West feel better because when we don't have a whole lot of, we're at least doing something. And when Mariupol, when a maternity hospital in Mariupol, gets blown to bits, and when Kyiv has been destroyed, there is a need to do something. So it is certainly now it's more of a punishment. I think the problem that we are facing, though, is we sort of equate always Putin with the Russia itself, and Putin is the decision maker, but many of these sanctions are deeply hurting the Russian people, and I think that with rising food prices, even those who are outside the country, those who've decided it was time to leave, they have no access to their money, and so I think it makes us feel good. There's not a whole lot we can do if we're not going to, escalate militarily, which I think is the right decision. But the Russians have certainly, taken notice. But they're also, with gas prices and oil prices so high, there is, Russia thinks that it probably can persist on, its economy can persist. The regime might persist, but that doesn't necessarily mean the lives of the Russian people are going to be any good.
I'd like to shift the discussion now a little bit towards looking ahead. Marie, Putin's actions, I think, make it very difficult, obviously, as long as he sits in the Kremlin, to imagine or envisage any sort of normal relationship between the West and Russia, between the European Union and Russia going forward. So I'm wondering if you think this will reduce Europe's room for maneuver in its own foreign policy, right? We've got the strategic compass that's about to be, adopted at the EU co-meeting next week. There's this question of strategic autonomy going forward and whether or not this can, still be on the table in an era when Europe clearly has to focus more on stuff going on in its own neighborhood than talking about these, grandiose visions of projecting power into the Indo-Pacific. So, is Europe's ability to embody a third way between Washington and Moscow and to develop more autonomy fundamentally constrained by the fact that relations with Russia are going to be adversarial for the foreseeable future?
Well, it obviously has a double effect on European foreign policy. So far, it is accelerating both the awareness in European countries of what Europeans need to do to become a geopolitically relevant actor, which the EU has not been so far. And so it accelerates the discussions about the strategic compass. It makes decision-making faster on foreign policy issues. And basically, the Europeans have been acting in a much more decisive way on Russia than they ever had been able to do over the last years, or at least since 2014. Now, over the long run, there will be two challenges. One will be, as you said, to be able to act geopolitically, not only in regard to this crisis, but to act more globally, because obviously a lot of resources and thinking will be dedicated to just issues of very immediate European security. And the second challenge is how you deal with this crisis in the long run, how you address the Russian issue in a meaningful manner without being able to engage with the Russian leadership as you used to do. How do you use the sanctions instrument when you have decided very strong sanctions very fast, and then the crisis lasts? The war probably gets dirtier. So the public is waiting for decisive action, and you basically don't have much room for maneuver for that kind of decisive action. So how do you manage the expectations of your public, but also of Ukrainians and of other international actors? These, I think, are the two challenges that the Europeans will have to address in terms of foreign policy over the next month, at least.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Sergey, you're a historian of the Cold War, so I'm wondering if you could put on your historian's hat for a second and tell us, are we looking at a new Cold War right now? Is that an apt comparison with two rigid blocs facing off for a long time? And even, during the Brezhnev era, we saw energy links between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Even that is likely to disappear now. So what's left at this point?
So the answer to this is maybe, of course, as any good historian will have to say, because there are obviously continuities between the Cold War and what we have today. And I'll say what the main continuity is. It's very straightforward. It's the nuclear revolution that cannot be undone. The fact that Russia has nuclear weapons, sufficient amount of nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over, I think introduces a certain element into the relationship between Russia in the West that was also there during the Cold War, but is very different from anything that we had seen before that, right? So when people also talk about the dynamic being similar to the First World War, for example, I would say, well, no, this is not the case, because it leaves out this big question of nuclear revolution. So that is the continuity. There's also another continuity as far as the Russian kind of perspective on things is concerned, because the Russians during the Cold War, I should say Soviets as a historian, not the Russians, but the Soviets during the Cold War and the Russians today, they strive for this greatness, recognition as a great power, and we can be reasonably certain that this aspiration perversely actually is one of the major reasons why Putin has pursued the kind of policy that he has pursued. So that is another continuity. And that's interesting, because if you look at the Cold War from the Western perspective, it was much more always about the struggle for, the future of the world, modernity, different type of modernity, ideologies, capitalism versus socialism. But you don't see that sort of take as much on the Soviet side. There was always the sense that, the Americans are not giving us a place under the sun. And you can see continuity in terms of contemporary Russian understanding of the world. But there are also significant differences. The key significant difference is just what I just mentioned, and that is the absence of universalist ideology on either side. People say that Putinism is an ideology. Putinism is not an ideology. Putin is a one-man show. If Putin drops dead tomorrow, Putinism will not continue in the same kind of form. There is no bright future. We're not trying in Russia to build anything great, right? If anything, there's a return to some kind of Russia of the past that never was, of the 19th century. So this is marked absence. In theory, that should actually improve communication between countries, because once you get stuck in ideologies, sometimes it's very difficult to find a common language. But unfortunately, in this case, it hasn't. And another thing that is key is a key difference between the Cold War and the present with Russia is that we have a different world today. We have China, a much more powerful actor. The world is much more multipolar than it was during much of the Cold War, certainly the early phases of the Cold War. Now that introduces a very different dynamic into the international system than the bipolarity of the Cold War would allow. Now, you mentioned one thing that I think is interesting, and that is the economic links. I think you're right to say that even during the Soviet Union, there were actually close economic links between the Soviet Union and the West. Indeed, considerable investment from Western countries into the Soviet industry. People don't realize that. But also, of course, export of Soviet oil and gas, which allowed the Soviets to stay afloat, despite the fact that their economy was going downhill already from the 1960s. But they received the cash. Today you might argue Russia and the West, they were much more integrated. We have this remarkable decoupling. We've been talking about decoupling between China and the US. Nobody foresaw this kind of decoupling that took place over 2 weeks between Russia and the West. So, today, that difference that existed between the Cold War and the post-Cold War is suddenly gone. Maybe not entirely, because I think Russia remains deeply connected to the West in some ways. In some ways, it's still very, very closely connected, but not as much as before.
Bill, if we're looking at the one key difference between Cold War 1.0 and Cold War 2.0, it has to do with the balance of power, right? There was a very clear equilibrium in Cold War 1.0. Cold War 2.0 clearly has NATO as a bloc, which is far more substantial, far more powerful than Russia alone. So what are your views on that? Do you think that if we are headed to a new Cold War, it has the potential to be much more dangerous and more unstable than the previous one?
There are all kinds of continuities. One thing is that it's often said that in this fateful Ukraine decision to invade that country, Putin is trying to relitigate the end of the Cold War to try to create a relationship with the Western security order that accords Russia a position more in accord with what he thinks it deserves and ought to have. And so there's this kind of continuity in some sense between the issues. There's another continuity I'd like to quickly point out, which is that for centuries, in a way, Russia has always felt that it had to compete with the West, It was afraid of the West, but it also wanted to be part and equal to it. And to do that, it often wanted friendly neighbors. Friendly. Problem is, it couldn't get friendly neighbors because these neighbors keep wanting to go west because Russia does not have a political economy that is providing all kinds of positive rewards for being its friend. And so part of this whole debate with Mearsheimer and all this stuff is, I mean, there's something to it, but in a way that was kind of a natural, I mean, the pull of Ukraine West had to do with certain deficiencies of Russia's political economy. Frankly, Putin came into the office in 2000 saying he wanted to modernize his country, make it attractive, make it flourishing, make it innovative, in which case maybe Ukraine's desire to head west wouldn't have been so intense. But Putin failed. He recreated one of these classic Russia political economies, which are not attractive to lots of people in Ukraine. And so they wanted to go west. And so now he's using force, just like Moscow used force in 1953, 1956, 1968 to hold its Eastern bloc together. So we're seeing that continuity. But here's where I want to finish up, is where you started the question, which is Russia is fighting what it thinks of as almost an existential war here for Ukraine, okay? Think of the diminution in Russia's position that represents. Putin has to know that what he's struggling for is something that was taken for granted as part of the Russian Empire, Soviet Empire, up until 1991. And so, like, the stakes are so different. The power position of Russia is so different. And that's where exactly what you said and what Sergey said in his comments about how different this is than the Cold War, and particularly how different Russia's place is. I'd be interested to hear Sergey's further comments. But many analysts see, if we do a further decoupling, and if Russia and if China continues to sort of backstop Russia, Russia's relationship to China in that partnership is going to be nothing like what I think advocates of Russia as a great power would wish. And I don't want to say subordinate, junior partner, puppy, nothing like that. Russia's too big and important, but nonetheless, not a relationship of equals would emerge if they are truly to be walled off from the world in a kind of new kind of division of the world into two blocks.
That's actually a great, your previous comment on Ukraine, I think, is a great segue into a question back to Sergey right now, which is the question of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine going back several centuries, right? This notion of the boundaries of the Russian nation, whether or not they include Ukraine, is something that Russian intellectuals have wrestled with for centuries. And they were exacerbated, of course, by the collapse of the USSR. So I'm wondering, how do you see Russia's internal debate, its internal political debate about these questions evolving as a result of this war? Will more and more people in Russia be prepared to acknowledge that Russia is and needs to be, as Dmitry Trenin might say, just Russia, and not include some sort of pan-Eastern Slavic unity anymore?
I think, I wish Trenin was the president of Russia, frankly, because he would direct this debate in the right way. But unfortunately, we have what we have, and it's undeniable that a large section of the Russian population at large do not really see Ukraine for an independent country. And I would even say the Russian intelligentsia, section of the Russian intelligentsia. I'm always the first to speak up for the Russian intelligentsia. They're generally very opposed to Putin and his hideous regime, and many of them are viciously opposed to this war and go out on the street and protest, and are currently facing prosecution. But at the same time, there are also those who are somewhat imperialistic in their outlook, maybe a minority. That said, okay, so this whole question of Ukraine's identity, Russian national identity, the dichotomy is itself problematic. And here's why. National identity is a process. It's well known that national identities are socially constructed. Yeah. So what we see today in Ukraine, with the Ukrainian population resisting Russian encroachment and fighting back, etc. This in itself is part of formation of Ukraine as a nation state. And this, of course, this is a process that has been this has been going on for a very, very long time. But I don't want to go back to Kievan Rus and say, during the Kievan Rus, Russians and Ukrainians were already independent nations. That's ridiculous. Yeah, that's ridiculous. When people say that, it's like, to me, as a historian, as a social scientist, that seems very bizarre. So yeah, and Russia is in the same category. Russian national identity is in the process of formation. It was very unclear where it was going to go in 1991. It is still highly unclear. But here's an interesting fact. We are now 30 years past the Soviet collapse. There's a generation now of Russians who are adults already in position of of relative responsibility in places, who grew up under Ukraine when Ukraine was an independent country and Russia was also an independent country. And they don't have the same sort of vision about Ukraine as maybe some of the older generation. I would say that I'm myself, although I'm not that old, but I'm of the last generation that still kind of saw Ukraine as part of the USSR. Because, as a kid, I would go to Ukraine and, my family is Russo-Ukrainian, et cetera, et cetera. But in recent years, that process has not, there's been a decoupling between Russia and Ukraine and formation, of very, very different narratives. So it's interesting that Putin is trying to bring that narrative back. I don't know how much purchase it really has among especially the younger people. It seems to me that Russia is in this final agony of understanding itself as Russia and letting others just be themselves.
Thanks very much. And just to our audience, thank you for all of you for posing your questions in the Q&A section. We'll get to some of them a little bit later in the panel, but I'd just like to invite our panelists, if they'd like to type their answers to any of them that particularly appeal to them, please feel free. And a reminder as well to our audience that our panel will be concluding at 1/4 the hour. So that's at 12:15 Eastern time. So please do stick with us until then. I want to just continue along this axis and go back to Paul to try to understand, again, the way that Russia conceives of and behaves towards its so-called near abroad. A lot of Russian foreign policy actions, when you've seen interventions, they've been decisive in recent years and decades, but they've also been limited to a certain extent, right? I'm thinking about Georgia in 2008, right? I'm thinking about the Donbass intervention in 2014, right? Again, just take a small chunk of territory, basically, don't go all out, right? The Syrian intervention in 2015, limited to air power, right? More or less. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as well, Putin sat on the sidelines for almost that whole conflict in 2020, before coming in and putting together some sort of regional compact with the Turks. And then again, just recently, just earlier this year in Kazakhstan, right? Very short, time-limited CSTO multilateral operation, rather than everyone who was saying at the time that this is 1968 in Czechoslovakia all over again, right? That model was not followed on February 24th as it relates to Ukraine. Why is that?
Yeah, and I think you could also, some of the, the very tailored interventions, you could also talk about sort of some of the interventions in Africa that Russian troops or Russian mercenaries have done. I think Ukraine, like Belarus, is an existential issue for the Kremlin elite. All the former Soviet countries are important. But Central Asia is kind of landlocked, doesn't have a whole lot of places to go. Armenia and Azerbaijan, then again, they kind of depend on Russia. But Ukraine, both the sort of the psychological importance the country has for the Kremlin elite, and if you actually read some of the some of the writings and some of the speeches of Putin, Nikolai Patrushev, the Russian Security Council advisor, you sort of get that these are they don't know history very well. I think they get historical documents and they read them bits and pieces. But this is a key issue. Now, Russia has, in many ways, reasserted its influence in the region, whether that is through the CSTO. We saw that the ability to use the CSTO through the Eurasian Union. It's not a very effective union, but at least it's there. But Ukraine is the biggest country that's been out there. It has effectively swallowed up Belarus already. And I think Russia certainly hoped and thought they would be able to do something limited. I think the Kremlin has really, Ukraine has changed. All these countries around Russia have changed significantly over the past 30 years. But as some of my colleagues in Russia have said, the Kremlin has had a difficult time understanding that, as the Russian MFA. They send their best people to places like Brussels and Washington and Ottawa, and not to places like Kyiv or Yerevan. So I think this is an existential issue. Putin is looking at his legacy, and sort of pulling Ukraine back is part of that. And I think it was supposed to be more limited, but I think just the problems and the miscalculations have made this a much wider war than Russia anticipated. I think they really felt that the threat of war, the threat of surrounding the country, the threat of just moving in would lead the Ukrainians to capitulate, and that has not worked. And so they've actually had to move from sort of a limited to a far more deadly use of force.
Marie, over to you now. Obviously, this is very difficult to contemplate right now, seeing the images that we're seeing coming out of Ukraine. But there clearly is an argument to be made that Russia is the most powerful country in Europe, and a security order in Europe, on the European continent, that effectively excludes the most powerful country on the continent, at least from the core of that order, right, from NATO, from the European Union, is not going to be a stable order. So at some point, when the dust settles on this crisis, there's going to have to be a discussion again, maybe in a year, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 20 years, but it will have to happen at some point on finding some sort of adequate place for Russia in Europe. Do you agree? Does that discussion need to be resumed somehow with the lessons of the past 30 years in mind? And when do you think, that discussion reasonably could begin to take place, and what perhaps could it look like?
Well, I think that the war is actually the latest and the most terrible avatar of a situation that has been going on for already some years, because the whole post-Cold War security order that had been elaborated during partly the 80s and mostly the 90s was already beginning to evaporate over the last years. You had important treaties like Open Sky Treaty, a number of arms control treaties, organizations like the OSCE, which has been in crisis for at least the last 10 years, if not more. And all of this, which had been at the core of European security, was not functioning for a number of years already. There had been attempts, and the most recent and probably most spectacular was President Macron's attempt to say we need to have a discussion about security with Russia, because there won't be a European security order without taking into account Russia. But obviously, none of these attempts have led to anything, probably because Russia was actually part of the problem, and of why all these elements of a European security order had been disappearing over the last years. This discussion will have to be started again, but I don't know on what basis it will be started. And first and foremost, I don't know when we will be able to start this discussion again, because obviously now is not the right time to discuss security, borders, territorial integrity, respect of each other's sovereignty, etc., with a country that just started to invade its neighbor. So it's part of the problem, and it will have to be addressed. But I don't think anyone in Europe at this point has the beginning of an idea of about how, when, and with whom you start this discussion.
I just want to turn to two questions from the audience quite briefly and direct them both towards Paul. We've touched on these issues a little bit so far, but just to get a clear response on both, one of our audience members draws a difference between reaching a ceasefire and reaching actual de-escalation between Ukraine and Russia, between the West and Russia. So in your view, what would actual de-escalation look like, and what sort of fundamental political principles would it have to be based upon? And we've got a second question as well on how do you rate the chances of change at the top in the Kremlin in Russia?
I'll take the second one first. As I said before, I think all of these regimes, these authoritarian regimes, look extremely secure until one day they are not. And we've seen, the Yanukovych, regime, which we saw this was all started. All of this started. We talk about NATO. This entire war originated in 2014 over Ukraine's desire to join the EU, not to join NATO. It's evolved since then. But that fateful decision helped destabilize the Ukrainian government, and the people, rose up and really kind of pushed him out. Now, I don't see that happening in Russia. I think there are some very brave people protesting, and there are brave people speaking out. But first, we are seeing this, the penalties for speaking out, and the penalties for talking about Ukraine in a without the state narrative are growing. And there is this level of fear growing. So I don't necessarily see a bottom-up change. You never know, though, but I don't necessarily see it. Many Russians are getting their news from the Russian media, which is a very one-sided view of this story. So I don't necessarily see that. I do see, if there is going to be a change at the top, I think it would have to be some sort of elite maneuvering. But nobody has really good insights into what is going on inside the Kremlin. We are seeing splits. We are seeing some oligarchs push back, criticize. We are seeing some security officials get dressed down and or fired. But I don't think we are yet at the moment where we're seeing a definitive shift within the elite against Putin. Most of the people, they recognize if Putin goes, they could end up losing a lot as well, particularly once the war has started. So I think anything is possible. Someday the Putin regime will end. But I'm not sure if that will happen. But if it does, it will be more from a top down as opposed to a bottom up, is my sense. As far as de-escalation, I do think a de-escalation would certainly be. We could have a ceasefire, but we could also, the humanitarian corridors, that could be the basis. Of something, helping the civilian populations, getting humanitarian aid in. I think it'll be difficult. I think particularly we have Western publics who are very very upset about the brutality that they're seeing, and we see lots of calls in the United States and Europe for no-fly zones. We're seeing lots of calls for escalation, and I think. The populations both, it's very easy for me to advocate for something like that. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., but these are Ukrainian lives, and so I think we need to be aware as outsiders that Ukraine is going to have to make its own decisions, and we shouldn't hold up every single principle we might have because there are lives here at stake. I also think having a dialogue, a Ukrainian-Russian dialogue, that's going to be really hard. But even a Russian, American, Russian, European dialogue, that's also given hard, particularly because the stakes are extremely high for the Russians who could participate. But I think, particularly as the West goes around sanctioning, we need to keep lines open to the Russian government. And I sadly think, we've sanctioned, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and so many of the lines in are now that much more complicated. And so I think, reestablishing those lines, having those discussions, I think are key, as opposed to, a lot of the offhand comments that we see and fiery rhetoric we see coming out of all capitals, Moscow, Europe, and North America.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. We've got just over 20 minutes left, and I want to turn back to Bill now. We are at IPD, a North American think tank. We operate both in Canada and in the United States. So I'm wondering if you could help us think through this issue a little bit as North Americans and what we should be prioritizing or preparing for as a result of this war looking into the future. Do you think that North America has a fundamental stake in peace and cooperation and operational security orders on the Eurasian supercontinent, or rather, is it more in our interest at this point just to accept the reality of the world as it is and to be steeling ourselves for some sort of long-term great power competition?
Well, I just want to say that I think, just following up from what Marie and Paul, basically, I think what they said is, but I just want to reiterate the sagacity and wisdom of what they said, which was kind of like, I'm totally sympathetic. I think North Americans, I think NATO, I think US, Canada had an interest in trying to create a security order in a security order in Europe with which both we, the Europeans, and the Russians could have been satisfied with. We failed. I think mainly for things, honest to goodness, I don't know whether there was an agreement that could have been achieved, but we failed. The problem is Marie, I want to jump off what she said. The problem is when you unleash war, you don't have to be a great historian like Sergey to know that when you unleash war, you open up a Pandora's box. You don't know where it's going to go. Clausewitz wrote about this. Passions are unleashed. So to think that we can now sit down with Putin and have a rational conversation about a European order, which I think probably was possible, although I agree with the critics of the West, we were lame. We didn't pay attention. We thought we could kick the Russia can down the road. It was bad statecraft. But to think that we could have that conversation now, given what has happened in Ukraine, it's just not going to happen. You're pie in the sky. You have to be politically realistic. I do wish our leaders could stop personalizing this. I wish, frankly, they would say that the question of Mr. Putin's war crime should be settled by an international tribunal, but not by Joe Biden. I wish we could put an implant in these guys' heads before they took office. They could stop talking like this, but we're democracies. We don't have control over communication. So we're going to say these crazy things, which is going to make a deal much, much harder. So to get to the point of your question, I actually think, as brutal as this sounds, from the standpoint of NATO, this thing is going to probably end up with NATO being a lot stronger, and the absolute opposite of what Putin wanted. And yet the problem is the victims of it will be the people who pay the price for it will be Ukrainians, and to a lesser degree Russians, who are subjected to a more authoritarian regime. It's hard for me to see how we're not actually reifying the current order that we all think, I think probably most people on this call think was flawed from 1991 on. But thanks to this disastrous decision, we are reifying this order rather than talking about some fundamental revision of it. And I think if I had to choose looking at US national interest, they're probably best served right now by solidifying it and strengthening it and making it more robust for possibly some future negotiation. But for now, I think you're going to be seeing that strengthening of the so-called Western House in response to this. I just don't see how any realistic politician could think there's a different response to this crisis than that one.
I hope Sergey can put on his historian's hat again here and help us to understand the past 70 plus years of history. A lot of people talk about the post-war order since 1945 with the institutions that we have until today, but others point to 1991 as embodying a new order, and they situate the beginning of the liberal international order sometimes in 1945, sometimes in 1991. Are we living through a breaking point right now, or is this sort of the continuation of something that we've been living through since 1945?
Well, first of all, I would just like to agree completely with Bill on the issues that he addressed just now. That is to say that things did not go right over the last 30 years, but now, of course, we are going down that very unclear road. But it clearly does exclude Russia from what we can understand, and Russia is basically, Russia is basically at fault for it. Yeah, we can see that both sides have contributed to the problems, but in the end, Russia was the one that brought to the decision point by invading Ukraine. So what will, but this broader question of international order, if you look at it from a long-term perspective, then, obviously there's the Russians will say that international order has been the same going centuries before. mean, the Russians, at least what Putin has been trying to peddle, is a kind of a conception of great power politics that goes back to at least the early 19th century, if not 2 days previous. And then we had 1945, which was interesting as well, in the sense that this was marked by Yalta Conference, which separated spheres of influence, and the Soviets had theirs, and there was implicit or explicit, in some ways, recognition of the Soviet sphere of influence, which is why when in 1956 the Soviets invaded Hungary, or in 1968 invaded Czechoslovakia, there wasn't really any response from the West. So what Putin is trying to sell us, as it were, is a conception that is very similar to that. That is, we've always tried to have our sphere of influence, and what is the problem? This is how things have always been, because we're a great power, therefore we deserve a sphere of influence. So in this sense, there's profound continuity, but obviously there's a different approach from the perspective of US liberal internationalism, and that is that this whole talk about spheres of influence is completely out of place, and that it means that small powers like Ukraine, Eastern European countries, the Baltics, they don't get a right to say, well, that's not right. They should be allowed to have a right to say and choose their own destiny. So this is really about, it's not about one order breaking and the other coming to the fore. I think it's about different visions of international order to begin with. And those different visions have persisted through the years and into the present. As far as the Kremlin goes, they never accepted the unilateral of US unilateral order. Even in the 90s, I don't think they accepted it. So therefore, it's not a question of shifting order as much as of clash of perceptions.
Thanks. Can I just go immediately back to Bill on this, because I know you've thought about this a lot. Do you think that the international order is still liberal in any appreciable sense at this point as a result of this war? How do you understand this term liberal international order? Because, this is something that we talk about a lot in Canada. Our former foreign minister, current deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, has spoken a lot about the rules-based international order. So can you help us situate those concepts a little bit and where they apply today?
I'm always a little nervous about using this term order, although I've used it. I mean, we can't not use it. It's like the term international community, when we really mean us, we say international community, we mean, the us and the countries we like, but still, I think there is actually something there. Look, the Russians will be the first to point out all the hypocrisy that we have. They're the first to point out that we break rules. The U.S. does, other Western countries do. They'll throw Kosovo at you. They'll throw Iraq at you. Probably an illegal war. Most international lawyers would say. I still think in the blatant nature of it, it can't be compared to what they just did. I mean, Zelensky is not Saddam Hussein. Come on. But all of that said, there is undeniably an effort to infuse some liberal principles into some international understandings, norms, and rules. It's the fact that the most powerful country in the world happened to be basically a liberal society with all of its flaws mattered in some sense. So there are a few of these things. And with all of its violations, with all of its hypocrisies, the U.S. generally doesn't go and invade countries and take territory and then say they're part of the U.S. I mean, he's just kind of like Lavrov. You tell me, Sergey, really, have we done that? Okay. Mr. International Lawyer, Sergey Lavrov. I've had to sit at Valdai conferences listening to this guy lecture me on international law so many times. But come on, for goodness sake. So the idea that you are simply going to take raw military power and you are going to invade a country and take away its sovereignty in this way, when it is recognized by 193 countries in the United Nations as a sovereign country, where you're going to recognize these little statelets where nobody supports you, you are departing from some kind of order. And there is some kind of principle at stake here. So it's not just entirely, I'll be, as an old realist, I'm the first guy to note all the hypocrisy and all the power politics that the Americans play. But there is a kind of order here. And in this, since Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, I can't remember a use of force in international politics that was this blatantly kind of contradictory to the Russian attempts to justify this are just really, these guys are smart. They know that they've got bad talking points. Okay. They've got bad talking points. So there is an order issue at stake here. If this thing is seen to succeed, this raw use of heavy metal diplomacy, of armor, throwing it into a country, that's not good, okay, for certain norms and principles that have been out there with all of their flaws and all of the hypocrisy and all of the degree to which they've been honoring the breach. They do matter to some degree, and they are to some degree at stake here.
Bill, I agree with you, but let me just briefly, Zach, if you allow me to sort of slightly contradict and also contradict myself in some ways. But when I say that the Russians have a different perception, and that goes back historically, their reference points are their own history and not necessarily what the Americans are doing. That is to say, they'll look at Hungary in 1956. I mean, they used brutal force to suppress Hungarian freedom fighters. Czechoslovakia in 1968, the same thing. They used brutal force, and that was kind of recognized, if you know what I mean, in the sense that it was accepted by the West that this was, well, that was their sphere of influence. And that, interestingly, I think is one of the reasons that Putin actually decided to use military force in Ukraine, because he thought that essentially Ukraine, not being covered by Article 5, was actually implicitly recognized as being already within Russian sphere of influence. He may have miscalculated on this, but this, I think, is his thinking that is rooted in the kind of conceptions that drove Soviet actions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. That is, those are their reference points.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Not to hijack the conversation, but if you read these statements by Russian intellectuals, thinkers on international relations, these kinds of reports that are put out by Valdai and Storp, you sort of read what they mean by international order and what they mean by multipolarity. That's exactly the kind of order they're talking about. But unfortunately, Ukrainians just disagreed. I mean, in part because of Russia's ham-handed policy towards Ukraine over the last 10 years. If Russia had invaded, if Putin's vision of this invasion had actually worked and they'd done a quick regime change, you would have seen people in the West basically saying, oh, okay, it's bad, it's unfortunate. We'll put some fake sanctions on for a while. We'll go back to business as usual. But Ukrainians had a different idea, so that's a really big conundrum for Moscow's foreign policy.
Can I just turn to Marie now and talk quickly a question about relating to EU foreign policy? Should North Americans have faith in the EU's ability to manage its own affairs on the European continent as it relates to security and defense going forward? How much do you think this momentum, this unity you're seeing right now on the European front among member states as it relates to getting serious about security and defense, how much can that momentum actually be sustained?
That's a good question. And actually, it was very much a debate in Europe before the start of the war, and especially end of last year when this whole crisis started and the US were at the table, but the Europeans were not. And there was a big debate among Europeans about why we're not there, why are we not relevant in a discussion that directly concerns our security interests. I think things have changed over the last weeks because Europeans have managed to get back at the table by coordinating with the US, by talking to the Ukrainians and the Russians, and by coordinating among themselves and managing to have united positions, which was very much a difficulty when it came to Russia in the last years. I think the war has accelerated the awareness by Europeans that they needed to get serious about security issues and to be able to address their own security by themselves. Now, another effect of the war will be that it will definitely reinforce NATO, because that's the most natural forum to discuss security in Europe for most Europeans. So there will be a challenge in addressing a possible contradiction between more EU security on the one hand and more NATO on the other hand. But I don't see it as completely contradictory. You can have more EU-led security inside NATO, and that's probably the direction in which most Europeans want to go now. So whether the US can trust the Europeans with that or not, it's for the US to decide, basically.
Right. We've only just got a few minutes left at this point, so I just want to go around the horn and ask that each of you keep your comments to 1 minute if possible. And it's the famous question, Lenin's question, that remains pertinent to this day. Что делать? So what are your immediate recommendations at this point in time for Western governments? But also, how can those immediate policy recommendations be tailored to keep open the greatest range of policy options over the longer term as well as it relates to Russia? So I'm going to start with Paul, then I'm going to go to Sergey, over to Marie, and then we'll finish with Bill. So Paul, go ahead.
Sure. So a couple things. I think I would agree with Bill. We need to be very careful in our language in how we describe each other's leaders. I think the rhetoric coming out of both Moscow, and I'm paying more attention to Washington, but also Berlin just today, has really been quite unhelpful for de-escalating this crisis. I think we need to be paying tremendous attention to the humanitarian impacts of this. We are seeing not only the humanitarian impacts in Ukraine, but we're seeing blow over into countries that really don't have the capacity to deal with this. This includes places like Poland, but also Moldova, where about 1 in 10 residents are now a refugee, but also in places like Armenia, where we're seeing about 50,000 Russian citizens flee Russia as well. And so there is a broad humanitarian need, and that flight is facilitated in part by the authoritarian nature of Russia, but also the sanctions and the lack of economic opportunity. So I think we just need to be aware that all of our actions so far are having broader and broader humanitarian impacts.
Thanks so much. Sergey, over to you.
So Western policy towards Russia has been problematic for many, many years. So, for example, there has not been sufficiently strong action on Russian dirty money that would settle in places like London, for example. This has now been unfortunately addressed, and oligarchs are feeling the bite of sanctions. At the same time, it seems to me that there's a tendency to sort of straighten the stick by bending it the other way, and by applying a kind of a sanction regime on Russia that may not necessarily cause the desired outcomes. I'll give you an example. There are Russians who are now fleeing Russia, fleeing oppression in Russia, including intellectuals, etc., younger people. They are facing difficulties in using their cards, for example, when they get to the West. They can't even do that because you're not able to draw on that funding. Is that useful? I don't know. The merits of this can be debated, but basically what we need to try to do with Russia, and that's just one small example, is to project an image or to project a message that is very similar, actually. I don't know if you've seen Arnold Schwarzenegger's statement. I liked it a lot, really kind of addressing, just speaking, telling the Russians that actually it's not about Russians as Russians. It's about the hideous regime in the Kremlin. And the Russians need to understand that. But it would be, I think, important to drive that further and to really be truly open to the idea that actually many Russians might be, I don't know how many, but certainly some Russians are definitely against the regime, to facilitate their travel to the West, their ability to run away from Russia, etc. And you might say, well, why should we do that when the Russians are bombing the hell out of Ukraine? And that's a valid point, frankly. That's a valid point. So I find myself conflicted as a Russian. But on the other hand, I also feel that we should have a longer vision in mind, and we should project a positive image of engagement with those Russian forces that really won't change. And also maybe help in this way and actually help bring down the regime by taking out the brightest, the most, the smartest people out of Russia, open opportunities in the West for those people to come. Not the oligarchs. Forget the oligarchs. Keep them out. Do not take their money. Open to the young Russians, to people who won't change, who are opposed to the regime. That, I think, is one thing where we need more thinking on how to apply the sanctions weapon. We haven't seen that enough, unfortunately, so far.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sergey. Marie, over to you on the equilibrium between driving a hard bargain and demonstrating restraint. What should our policy options be?
Well, in the short term, I think the absolute priority should be to have a ceasefire. And that implies supporting Ukraine because it's a very strong Ukrainian resistance, which will allow to convince the Russians to accept a ceasefire. It also means keeping channels open with Russia because you need to convey them the message that this is a priority and it's not out of touch. But you also need to have back channels with Russia and other countries closer to Russia conveying the same message. If we manage to get China conveying this message to Russia, that would be very powerful, but I'm not sure we're there yet. And then there is a second issue which is related and which is quite out of the radar, I'm afraid, for now. The war is having an impact on third countries in the neighborhood, but also further away. Countries like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan have their economies they have very harsh consequences for their economies. The same is true for Armenia. So at some point, if we want to keep a policy vis-a-vis these countries, we also need to be able to take into account the impact of the crisis that this war is having on them, and not just think they are allies of Russia, so we should just look away and let them with Russia. And of course, the war will have economic consequences globally, which the West and international powers should be able to address, be it food prices rising, energy prices rising, etc. This will all need to be mitigated in some ways to make sure that all countries take into account the stakes of peace and not just the immediate stakes of keeping good relations with Russia to have.
Thanks so much,
benefit.
Thanks so much. And sorry to cut you off. We are technically out of time. So Bill, 30 seconds, final thoughts?
The trick of diplomacy here is going to be tough on the fact that we cannot really negotiate the things that Russia cares about as long as it's doing what it's doing in Ukraine. But I do think, despite all what we said before, our leaders, our diplomats have to have the ability to talk about a possible future if Russia were to cease what it's doing and rejoin the sort of community. Like, what's our future? How do we think about Russia's place in Europe? And for that, we need to think about what conditions we would to take these sanctions off and how we could put Russia back in a position better than it was in 2014, if only it stops doing what we don't want it to do, which is wantonly killing Ukrainians.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you to all four of you. This was a fantastic discussion. I just want to remind our audience that this is the third out of a series of 4 panels that we're holding in the space of a week on this crisis. We've already looked at China's role in the crisis, as well as the fallout for the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And then next week on Monday, please do register for a panel. We're going to be unpacking what all of this means for Canada, the impact of Russia's vision of Ukraine for the future of Canadian national security and Canadian foreign policy. That will be on Monday, the 21st of March, this upcoming Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So please visit our website at peacediplomacy.org and you can register for our panel there. Thank you all so much. Merci beaucoup. Spasiba большое. And we will see you all again very soon.